like to take this last hour to do two things. One, I'd like to return to you and your legacy, and then maybe we talk a little bit about the future. But tell me, what do you consider to be your legacy? And I mean, you have been the dominant revolutionary figure in the industry for so long. You've had a tremendous impact, from the innovations that we talked about earlier to the ideas of how we can re-regulate. But what do you really see? In fact, we were talking here just a few minutes ago about one of the issues. When deregulation came, Alfred Kahn's big push was for People's Express. Tell us a story about People's Express.
Well, People's Express was started by a man by the name of Don Burr, bought some 747s, went out to Newark Airport, and started selling tickets at very low prices. It was really not unlike, there was at about the same time, there were a raft of what were called public charters. Mm-hmm. People had DC-10s or 747s, and they were under the charter rules, which the CAB was in the process of essentially eliminating. You didn't have to be a member of a charter group. You could have a charter operation and you could sell tickets to the public. They're so-called public charters. But you had to buy your tickets 30 days in advance. And they were selling seats between New York and LA for about half what we were selling before. And People Express were doing about the same thing. So we said, what can we do about this? And we thought about it, and said, these guys have all these seats and they have very low cost. And suddenly a revelation came to us. Just said, we've got a 50% load factor, so we've got half the airplane empty. So we have all those seats available at zero cost. All we have to do is figure out a way to keep the people that are already on board from migrating down to the cheaper seats. So why don't we just do the same thing? We'll sell tickets 30 days in advance, just the way the charter guys are. And we'll sell as many seats as people want to buy, up to about 60% of the airplane. And that'll leave us the other 40% for the people who need to make a travel decision in the last 30 days. Work like a clock. And the public charters just went away. And we did exactly the same thing with People Express. Said People Express price, whatever it was, $129, whatever. I said, well, you can ride on American Airlines for $129. You just simply have to buy your tickets 30 days in advance, and you have to stay away at least one Saturday night. Everybody said, that sounds like a deal to me. And so they bought tickets from us instead of from People Express, because, of course, the newspapers were full of people sleeping on the floor at People Express, and they had backpacks, and the floor was covered with sandwich wrappings, et cetera, and that wasn't exactly the environment we offered. The consequence is it worked for us. Don Burr, who was, again, I always had a pleasant relationship with Don Burr, but he told me years later that his mother had called him up and said, have you seen these cheap tickets on American Airlines? I just bought one. And at that point, Don said, I knew I was finished.
That's a great legacy to have. It shows how great management, good innovation, always thinking ahead, and keeping the competition out. You said at one point that there were about 150 new entrants almost immediately.
There have been more. Well, there were lots of new entrants. In the years since deregulation, there have been close to 200 new entrants, most of whom, as I say, they came into the business and they, for some reason or other, believed that because they had lower costs, they could prevail. But people don't seem to understand cost has nothing to do with price. I mean, the cost, something costs you what it costs you. Right. The price of it is what the public is willing to pay. And the price of an airline ticket is defined by what the lowest common denominator, the lowest price out there is, which every other airline will match. So the airline industry as a whole has never been able to sell its product at high enough prices to cover its costs, except during the years of regulation.
You also mentioned the hub process in Texas, in Dallas, Fort Worth, and tell us your experience. What was American doing there, and what were there? You mentioned Branoff.
There was nothing particularly magic about that. In fact, the matter is, after it became clear, when deregulation occurred, you could now fly wherever you wanted to fly. So you had to find the most efficient way to create the maximum number of markets. I think if you take 50 cities on one side of a hub, 50 cities on the other side of a hub, you immediately create 2,500 individual markets. So what you want is the largest possible hub, which would create the maximum number of potential point-to-point markets. So if you can get 70 times 70, now you've got 4,900 markets. And that's what we set out to do in Dallas. Delta did it in Atlanta. Both American and United did it in Chicago. Continental did it in Houston. And it remains the least expensive way to link lots of places. Now, it isn't the least expensive way to fly somebody from, let's say, Los Angeles to New York. If you're going to just fly people from Los Angeles to New York, it's cheaper to do it nonstop. But a great many people travel from Los Angeles to New York by way of one of the hubs. And they do that because the particular time that they want to leave is more convenient to go by one of the hubs. Or they want to stop in the hub city and meet with somebody and then get on an airplane and continue to the destination city. Or for some other reason. Or the particular nonstop flight at the most convenient time for them is full, but there's a close time parallel on one of the connecting flights. So the fact of the matter is the hub and spoke system gets, there's been a lot of adverse commentary about the hub and spoke system being an expensive way to do business. It isn't an expense. It's an expensive way to take people from Los Angeles to New York, but it's not an expensive way to take people from, for the sake of discussion, Santa Fe, New Mexico, to Des Moines, Iowa. It's the only way, because there will never be nonstop service from Santa Fe, New Mexico to Des Moines, Iowa. And there'll never be nonstop service on most of the city pair routes in the United States. So you link them by way of a hub. Now, to some extent, the hubs have become less efficient because as you get more new entrants come into the market, there is more nonstop service in those markets which are big enough to support nonstop service. That drives some of the traffic out of the hubs onto the nonstops. That forces the hub operator to use less efficient airplanes. That's bad public policy. You don't want that to happen.
Right.
So the very low-cost guy who offers nonstop service in a big city pair doesn't bring much to the party. Some people that fly between those city pairs get a lower fare. But the consequence, the penalty, is that a lot of people in smaller and middle-sized cities get much less efficient service. What's the trade-off?
So going back to your legacy, you did all of these innovations that have really reshaped the industry. What do you consider your legacy? What do you see as
I think I was the most successful airline executive of my time. I don't aspire to anything more than that.
That's not a bad way to aspire to. And you must have had some great negotiations in that process, some conflicts where your competitiveness was.
Look, running a business is all about conflicts. It's all about negotiation. It's all about all of the aspects of management. Mm-hmm. Negotiation is one of the aspects of management. All of the things that you do to operate a business, that's the whole process of management.
And as a negotiator, I have the highest respect for those who are very successful and who claim the credit of being the most successful CEO of an airline in the country. It's a wonderful thing, and it's another reason why we're very pleased to have this chance.
For some limited period of time. Who knows? Other times there are other people.
We have our own time, and it's really great. But there are more conflicts out there. We talked a little bit about the air traffic control system and the legislation we're facing. We haven't talked about emissions. We're on the road to Copenhagen. What happens to the airline industry if CO2 emissions come down?
I think nothing happens to the airline industry. You know, there's an analogy, let me share an analogy with you. Many years ago, Ted Kennedy was trying to get medical care for more people in the United States. I thought at the time, and I still think, and he thought, that a very good way to do it would be to require every business of every size to provide comprehensive medical care. That the outcome would be that all businesses of every size would have to raise their prices by an amount sufficient to cover the cost of health care, and that would be a better alternative than a tax. I mean, everybody would pay for universal medical care, but they'd pay for it in the price of goods and services. So he asked me if I'd come to Washington and testify on behalf of that bill, and I did. And I was pleased to do that because I thought it was the right thing to do, and I still think it's the right thing to do. I got 200,000 hate letters. From, you know, people around the country, people that run sandwich shops, people that do tailoring repairs, people that do every kind of business. You're going to put me out of business. You're a communist, you're a socialist, you're generally no good. And I'll never fly American Airlines again. Well, the fact of the matter is, of course, that it wouldn't have any effect on any business. If every business were required to do it, it would have no competitive impact at all. Simply raise the price level. But the fact of the matter is, and that's fine, and I didn't care what they thought of me personally, but as a business leader, you can't be very active in politics because that gives the public leverage to punish the company. So thereafter, I kept my mouth shut. But the analogy, right, is that what companies are going to do what public policy says they ought to do. So we're having this big debate, all right, about emissions. Let's suppose that emissions get included with the other emission rules, all right, which will raise the price of carbon and force airlines to raise their prices. That's what they'll do. Won't have any effect on airlines. Fewer people will travel, and thus, all right, the airlines will offer some less capacity than they offer today. Maybe capacity will go down by 10%. Maybe it'll go down by 20%. Airlines, like every other business, all right, what do you think is going to happen to the automobile business over time? We're going to have fewer automobiles, certainly in the Western world. China's going to make a lot more cars, so what's going to actually happen to emission levels is open to question. But the fact is, as we try to control emissions, as we try to deal with global warming, as we try and deal with carbon, as we try to deal with the shortage of petroleum, price levels are going to change. And that's all we're talking about. We're talking, and the impact on the airlines and the impact on the automobile business will be simply a reflection of how it has to change its prices and what the public chooses to buy.
Which leads to the political issue to be fair and equitable, so that it isn't one country's rules are different than others. So Copenhagen then becomes an important place to.
Sure. I mean, it's like, you know, it's like Doha. We never got Doha done, so we've got an imperfect set of trade rules. And what we do in Copenhagen will depend, you know, whether or not the world is able to reach agreement will depend on how quickly we can reduce carbon emissions. But I mean, it's not going to be the end of the world for any given industry. It's going to have an effect on the relationship of all industries and on what consumers choose to spend limited funds on.
Right. Let me turn back to our policy debate, the lack of a transportation policy and and air traffic control. Tell us about the debate itself. Where is that debate? And
well, air traffic, I think that debate has gone nowhere. Most countries other than the United States have spun off the operation of the air traffic control system into a public-private, it's really not a public-private partnership, it's a private corporation. But typically the governance of that corporation involves the airlines and private aviation and the government country in question, and sometimes the equivalent of the FAA, and they sit there as a board, but the business runs as a business. And in most of those countries, in fact, I think all of those countries, that business derives its revenue from fees, usage fees, which are some combination of so much per mile flown and so much per zone entered or exited, et cetera, et cetera. But it becomes a pretty complex billing system, but that's the way they raise the money to operate the air traffic control system. In this country, it doesn't work that way. The first place in this country has a much larger private aviation, general aviation function than any other country. Secondly, we have established a pattern of raising the money to provide air traffic control services by excise taxes, not by fees. General aviation has a tremendous repugnance for fees because they are very much concerned. Certainly, there's thousands, hundreds of thousands of private pilots, and they don't want to be confronted with the notion that every time they take off, they're going to get an invoice from the federal government. Now, the proponents of such a plan would exempt most very small airplanes, but it doesn't matter because the guys who have the small airplanes say, yeah, you're going to exempt me now, but what are you going to do down the road? And so, and we've got as well the conflict between the commercial airlines who would like to see a system of fees as opposed to taxes, and general aviation that doesn't have any patience for it, is prepared to pay more in fuel taxes, but not prepared to pay fees. And then you've got the controllers union, which today has the ability to go to Congress whenever the FAA doesn't negotiate a labor contract that the controllers like. And so the controllers are very much opposed to privatization. So what does all that mean? I think what it means is we are very unlikely to adopt a solution similar to those that other countries have adopted because we are different than those other countries and because we do not have a Congress that is willing and able to make judgments that are contrary to the desires of a highly focused constituency, which is what private aviation is.
Back in the early days of the Reagan administration, the air traffic controllers went on strike.
Right.
What effect, what happened at that time for you, and what effect has it had?
Well, the whole airline industry had to draw down the amount of flying that it did. The government brought in government controllers, gradually began to hire back the controllers, and the whole thing went away in about 6 or 9 months.
So it had no lasting effect?
It had no lasting effect, no.
Interesting, interesting. So what other legacies would you look at? What things have most struck you in your long years?
Well, I think, once again, I think in terms of legacies, I mean, look, there's a lot of practices that are out there today that we initiated. Yield management has been adopted all through the airline industry, all through the hotel business, the car rental business, lots of businesses where the price of a product ought to vary based on the intensity of use and the time of use. So yield management has become a generalized business practice, and we started it so that, and frequent flyer miles have become the second currency of the United States. And we started that. But other people have built on those foundations. So the fact that we thought of them first is a reflection on the creativity of the group of people we had at American for a period of time.
Well, knowing what you were doing in the early 90s on code sharing, do you have a special relationship or special experience with one of our Department of Transportation secretaries or White House?
Oh, you're talking about Jeff Shane. What Jeff Shane? Jeff Shane has been sort of one of the principal movers of U.S. transportation aviation policy for many years. He's a very pleasant guy. He and I have a nice personal relationship. We were in Rome together one time. As a matter of fact, he even went to see the Pope with my wife and masqueraded as me because I didn't want to go and he did. So we've had a very pleasant relationship, but the fact is Jeff and I have completely different ideas. he has sort of favored the policies we have followed, and I oppose those policies. But he's a nice fellow. He's just wrong.
Well, that's fair. And other secretaries, the secretaries of transportation that really set the policy or really, really antagonistic or made it possible
No, we
for you to
didn't.
work there?
We've dealt with a whole variety of secretaries of transportation. I don't really recall any particular incidents with any given secretary that were either particularly contentious or particularly portentous.
And so you never had an opportunity with Clinton and Cole to go to one of those
I
scrumptious
did- I
lunches
never went
or
to
dinners?
But of course, the story is, as you know, but again, you were there, that they each ate 5,000 calories, right?
It was a contest, actually.
which befuddled their brains.
Well, some of us at the Katzentisch, as the Germans say, did notice that they were having a contest, and they were out there trying to see who had the most.
Wow.
And Chancellor Cole weighed 300 pounds, and it was a formidable opposition for Mr. Clinton. Now, whether that had anything to do with their decisions on aviation, I don't know. I would not know, but aviation has played...
That was the story as we heard it.
That was well.
You were there. I wasn't.
I was there. Yes. The decisions were taken, and that relationship has been a very important one. And but you also mentioned your relationships in France and in you certainly as a worldwide network.
Once again, those sort of anecdotal stories that I tell you about the fact that the European countries, the Asian countries, the countries around the world, while signing up for the whole notion of open skies for equal opportunity for their carriers and ours, have generally not delivered that. So there have been long delays in finding takeoff slots, there have been long delays in finding airport facilities, which have been much more troublesome in terms of U.S. carriers finding opportunities abroad than it has been for international carriers finding opportunities here. So all of that simply adds up, the whole matrix of events. It adds up to my conviction that the international airlines have benefited a great deal more from the relaxation of regulation than the U.S. carriers have.
But you also have had a global view. I mean, American has been very strong in Latin America. You're in Asia. You're in Russia. What do you take away from the contribution that American makes to our international connections? What does it mean for America to have American Airlines?
Well, I think you put your finger on it as well as anybody can. The fact is, I think it is very important for any country, certainly any major country, to have an aviation industry that is competitive in the world. And U.S. airlines today are not competitive because they simply lack the financial resources. We have a great assets like anything else. We've got a lot of coal in the United States. At one time we had a lot of petroleum. We pretty much used that up. It's a big country. It's relatively large population and has been, of course, up to this recent juncture, very affluent. So it has been for many years the largest aviation market in the world by a wide margin. May not be that way in the future, but it has been in the past. And that has made it possible for the U.S. industry to build very large hubs. Those hubs are a source of international competitive strength. The guy with the biggest hub controls the most traffic. And we bargained all that away. The U.S. government bargained it all away by giving the international carriers access to those traffic flows through the mechanism of international alliances and code-shares. And that has had the effect of emasculating the international competitive capabilities of U.S. airlines. And I think that's a shame. So I'd like to see that undone. You know, Overstar has been talking about, Overstar's been talking about the whole notion of taking away antitrust immunity. I think that would be a good thing. If antitrust immunity went away, the alliances have to go away. And we would go back to having a larger number of competitors using the interline system. You know, code sharing is really nothing more, nothing less than an organized means of lying to consumers. Because you are saying to a consumer, you're going to be on the same airline. You're going to get on United in Des Moines, and you're going to go all the way to Warsaw on United, but you're not. You're going to go from Des Moines to Chicago, and Chicago to Frankfurt. Chicago to Frankfurt may be either Lufthansa or United, and from Frankfurt to Warsaw is going to be Lufthansa. So you're not going all the way on United. The fact of the matter is, there's no benefit to that. In fact, there is a disbenefit because I mean how many people wander around in airline terminals looking for their United flight, and there is no United flight. Certainly, a lot of unsophisticated first-time, one-time travelers end up in exactly those circumstances. At one time, you would have bought a ticket from Des Moines to Chicago on United, from Chicago to Frankfurt on United, then you'd have bought another ticket, right, from Frankfurt to Warsaw, either on a Polish airline or on Lufthansa, and you'd have known who was responsible for that leg of the journey. And all of the transfer of baggage and all of the interchange, use of clubs, etc., works just as well with the interline system as with a system when you don't tell the consumer the truth. I don't like code sharing. I think code sharing misleads the public. I think it distorts competition because it makes it unlikely that any other carrier can successfully operate, right, in the same markets where a code share partnership works.
And the interline were agreements between airlines themselves?
Yeah, they were
without
between
government.
airlines. Yeah.
And they covered baggage handling and
Baggage handling and ticket interchange and so forth and so on. And there's an article, I mean, you talk about regulation, there's an article recently following the event where passengers were trapped on the tarmac.
Yeah.
A customer today may find that he or she is flying on an airline, and that airline cancels the flight. Now, back in the days when we had a regulated industry, you could take that ticket to any other carrier, and they would accept it. They had to accept it. Today, that's not true. You walk down the concourse and say, you know, my Southwest flight just got canceled. You take it down to United, and I said, we don't know who Southwest is. We're not taking that thing. You want to go on our flight, you have to buy another ticket. Again, I don't think that's good public policy. That's like kind of saying, you can't come over to my house and use my toaster because I get my electricity from somebody different than you get your electricity from. So you can't use my provider's electricity. It's nonsense. Same thing in telephone lines.
So that really says that before deregulation, there was competition.
It was
So
a lot
what was
it
the
was
kind
a very
of- kind
intense.
of competition?
It was all kinds of competition. Right? Competition in terms of frequencies of flights. We could increase or decrease frequencies. Right? A lot of competition because in many cases the CAB allowed 3 or 4 airlines to fly the same city pair. Mm-hmm. Right? So the time of day, the service on board, the service in the terminal. Look, if I buy a computer today, I have to learn to speak a different language. Because when the computer breaks, I'm going to talk to somebody in India. You can be pretty sure they don't speak English very well. And you can also be pretty sure they don't know much about computers because they've got a script. Now, but there is no alternative to that. There isn't any real service competition in the computer business because in the computer business, as in the, but Apple comes along, what does Apple say? Apple says, I'm going to have my own stores. So if you're willing to use an Apple computer and it breaks, just bring it down and we'll fix it. Works pretty well. Apple's been gaining market share at a great rate. Good. That's a good arrangement. In the PC business, nobody has chosen to do that. I suspect somebody will pretty soon. Because I'd be happy to pay 3 times as much for a PC if I can take it down and get it fixed. And my guess is that in fact, in that world as it existed then, prices were pretty much the same, but service was very different. And a lot more flights were on time than are now.
So what was your big competition then? Was it
United, TWA.
And how did you compete? What did you do?
In terms of what kind of food service you put on board. You competed in how you trained your flight attendants. You competed in how you trained your ticket agents. You competed in terms of the facilities that you offered. You competed in terms of how many bags you lost. Right? You competed in terms of how you delivered the bag after it was, if it was lost, if it was. You competed in terms of on time. The most successful advertising campaign we ever did, we did a big thing called the On Time Machine. Mm-hmm. Right?
Can't do that today.
No, we can't.
But one high price for everybody.
One high price or one low price, depending on what's a high price and what's a low price.
So the price debate comes back, and price
debate comes back. And I think this, I don't think you can regulate. I don't think you can regulate the same way that you did. But I do think you can say, wait a minute, I'm not going to let you come into this business, all right? Get some used airplanes, go out and hire the cheapest possible labor that you can, and destroy the price level so that this guy who's been in the business for 30 years, all right, can no longer cover his cost of capital. I'm not going to let you do that, because it is like a utility. I'm also not going to let in the local community. I'm not going to let somebody come in and build a new power plant, right, unless I know that that guy's got deep enough pockets so he's going to be able to deliver electricity for the next 35 years. So what's the difference between a utility and an airline?
That actually comes to the basic issue.
Yes,
How
sure.
do you make?
Do you believe this?
Do you believe that the sunk costs and the structure is
something
unlike
that public
others?
Is something that public policy should defend,
Right.
or don't you?
Right.
I do, others don't.
So the trade-off is really, in order to have an airline industry, like having highways, there is a certain government component that has to be there.
Not a government component. There is a cost component that has to be covered by price, all right?
Right.
And if
Okay. All right.
if the free market structure, completely free market structure, completely deregulated structure, is going to undercut that price in such a way that the infrastructure cannot be defended,
Right.
and that's what's happened, then it's unsound public policy.
Particularly if your competitors, in a global sense, use a different model.
That's exactly right, and they do.
And they do.
Yeah.
They do. That's true. So tell us about your operations in China. Now there's a country that is a strong central government, if you will, communist run, can make decisions without regard to the market if it chooses. You're there, or American is there, I should say.
They've gone to China since I've been
Okay.
in the business. I don't know anything about the operation in China. And to the extent that Americans there, it's just a couple of point-to-point routes.
So
They're
it's
they're
not
not
a-
big in China.
Not big. But in terms of international, thinking of international issues, you have to think our policy.
Well, look. China's an interesting case in point. U.S. airlines, the aviation commerce between China and the United States is governed by a bilateral treaty. There's no open skies.
Right.
So there are a certain number of rights U.S. airlines have to fly between U.S. and China. Chinese airlines have to fly between China and the U.S. Chinese airlines generally do not use those rights because they don't think they're ready for international competition. They'll be ready soon enough, but for the most part, you don't find the Chinese national airlines flying to the United States. I think there are some that have recently begun to do that, but it's a recent development. Many of the U.S. rights to serve China were assigned many years ago to Northwest Airlines and United. They are not flown to China. They are flown to China by way of Tokyo.
Right.
Now, the Chinese dislike that intensely. But the United States government has been unwilling to take those routes away from United and Northwest, or to force Northwest and United to use those rights to fly nonstop, because of the fact that Northwest and United have built a very powerful hub in Tokyo, where it competes with JAL, and there's two national carriers, and I've forgotten the name of the other one offhand, but it doesn't make any difference. The fact of the matter is the United States, if if it chose to use those rights to develop a network of nonstop services to China, it could gain a great deal of dominance in markets to and from China it does not now have. But it has chosen not to do that for reasons that I don't understand. Because we can have a lot more service to China today than we have, just by using the rights that are already used, except they're used to fly to China by way of Tokyo. So again, I keep coming back in my own mind to this issue. We got to define, well, what is it we're trying to accomplish here? Are we trying to build a dynamic U.S. industry that can be internationally successful, right, or are we not? We're trying to do something else.
Yeah, and what are the elements there? If we're dealing with price, as we just talked about, if it's a price-driven process, then deregulation.
It is a price-driven. In the domestic marketplace, it is almost entirely price-driven. And so you have all the carriers come into the market, right, to develop much lower costs than the legacy carriers, and use those lower costs and prices to destroy the ability of the legacy carriers to compete internationally. That's what's happened.
Well,
both by handicapping the domestic airlines in the domestic marketplace and by providing advantages for their international competitors. So they're caught kind of like this, all in the name of consumerism.
And would you be open to an alternative reality than re-regulation?
Oh, sure. What's the alternative?
An open skies process that has more than price, that has these concerns?
Well, how can you create an aviation environment that is driven other than by price?
That's the question of routes, and well, they're all actually in there, aren't
They're
they?
all price-driven.
It's all price.
They're all price-driven.
So you have
the only way you're going to isolate, create motivations other than by price is to grant exclusive routes, which I don't think you want to do.
No.
Well, as soon as you grant exclusive routes, you get into the same problem that you're into with the alliances, where others can't compete. Right? Because the alliance partners, right, have hubs at both ends, nobody else can compete. So if you take somebody else in Chicago that wants to fly to Frankfurt, very unlikely that they'll be successful, because they're not going to carry any of the traffic that goes beyond Frankfurt. And without that component of the total traffic stream, you can't fly at all.
Unless, I hear you loud and clear, although that makes an argument for your other point about a comprehensive transportation policy, because if you get off at Frankfurt, you can go downstairs and take the train to most of the other local cities.
But not to Warsaw.
Not to Warsaw.
But taking the train is a very interesting example, very interesting, because for many years, right, when we did fly to Frankfurt quite often, I did my very best to get an interline arrangement with the German railroad, and I never succeeded. But Lufthansa had one. But they could never figure out how to make their software work with Sabre. Remarkable.
I actually remember that.
You remember that?
I remember that, yes.
And you remember the guy that was running the German railroad at the time? A big, tall guy.
Yeah.
And he approached me years later after I had retired. I said to him, whatever his name was, at the time I remembered, I said, "You never did that." He said, "Of course not. That would have hurt Lufthansa."
There you go. There's one competitive battle we didn't win.
That's right.
So,
one of many. So the fact of the matter is, the point is, there's absolutely no way that a German railroad company couldn't make their software work with Sabre. They just didn't want to hook up with American Airlines because that would damage Lufthansa. As I said earlier in this whole discussion, there are a whole array of various controls that international governments tend to put around their carriers to protect them in international markets. I don't know that that's a bad thing. I just want us to do the same thing.
Or in the case of a negotiator, you want our negotiators to be putting that into the negotiations so that level playing field, as we like to talk about all the time, actually is a level
Actually
playing
is,
field.
right.
Yeah, so
Which rarely happens.
That's why we have this kind of thing.
Well, but you supported an elimination of the nationality rule in the early 1990s.
When you say elimination
Elimination of the rule
nationality.
against foreign ownership and control of U.S. airlines.
No. No.
The economic circumstances were reversed, as you pointed out earlier.
If what now? If what circumstances are reversed?
Well, the American airlines were in probably a stronger economic position back then than their European
Well,
counterparts.
fact of the matter is, I suppose if somebody had said to us in the early 1990s that we could simply buy BA
Yeah,
or buy Lufthansa,
right.
I would have thought that was a pretty good thing. Now I think it's a bad thing. Because the fact is, all right, what would happen today, what would have happened then, is if we had bought BA or we had bought Lufthansa, we wouldn't have any interest in providing service within the UK or within Germany. It would have been simply an international arrangement. And if foreign international airlines now buy airlines, they're not going to have any interest at all in providing service within the United States.
Why not?
Because most markets are too small. And you're going to lose money. Look, if you're going to fly from Des Moines to Chicago or Dubuque to Chicago, all right, with a little airplane, all right, if all you want to do is feed your international network, maybe you'll fly once a day. But you won't fly 3 times a day because at the other 2 times a day, you don't have an international airplane going. So why would you bother?
So
If your only purpose is to get people, right, from Duluth to international markets, why would you fly between Chicago and Duluth 3 times a day? The answer is you wouldn't. Particularly since it's a known fact that service between Chicago and Duluth loses lots of money.
So that explains your quote from your speech, your wing speech that
Yeah.
I have here. Mystified by you are mystified by the
Yes, let's
apparent
have that quote.
willingness of U.S. negotiators to further weaken the domestic system by turning over control to people without any stake in making our domestic system
Absolutely
work.
right.
This is
Why
your
would you want to do that? Why would you want to do that? Look, it is a
complete
no sensible business person of any nationality is ever going to buy a U.S. airline.
Not now, perhaps.
Never.
We don't know.
Never. Wait a minute.
We
never,
haven't tried it. We haven't opened the skies.
Wait. Nobody's bought a U.S. airline within the United States. Everybody that's bought a U.S. airline has lost all their money. Right? So you want to provide an opportunity for international airlines to lose all their money? That's fine, except I don't mind
it's
if
a
they lose
strategy.
all their money. Yeah, that's a
It's a
strategy.
different outcome.
But the fact of the matter is, what you now have is you've now got the domestic system under the control of people that have no interest in providing domestic service.
But how do we know that? Since we've never tried it, how do we know?
We know it because you look at their motivations. You say, what conceivable reason could this person have to want to buy this airline, which constantly loses money? Now, do we really think that Air France is so full of capable executives they can come over here and tell us how to run airlines?
Well, they can't. They won't be able to work for U.S. airlines if Overstar has his way.
No, they won't be able to buy it either. But the reality is, there's only one reason for an international carrier to want to buy a domestic airline, and that is to drain off the international traffic. But they have no motivation whatever to provide any kind of a network within the domestic United States.
So that's part of the argument that Overstar has, and Brian was touching on the other part,
Which is?
the Overstar discussion about the United States should control all matters, management matters, the things that you earlier know about, and things like marketing, branding, fleet composition, route selection, pricing, labor relations. They all should be in American hands.
Well, perhaps so. I don't, that's a very nationalistic view. I'm not sure what most of those decisions have to do with national security. I do think that whether or not we have a domestic airline network is a major issue of both national economic health and national security. The U.S. airlines, as they sit here today, have 2 choices. They can try and figure out a way to make money flying within the United States, or they can go out of business. Right? An international owner has a 3rd option. I'll just go 3/4 of the way out of business, right? And just fly just enough airplanes to feed my international services. I don't want to give them that 3rd option.
And the only way that the American carriers could compete would be to recover their strength so that they could do equivalent under
Yeah.
the open skies that we were talking about. We're not there.
Yeah,
It's
we're
really-
not there because the U.S. industry simply lacks the financial capacity today to be internationally competitive. We need to find a way to make the domestic industry profitable.
And then we can
If as
negotiate.
it becomes profitable, right, our carriers will again have the ability to compete on a level playing field if we go out and make sure the playing field is level.
Yeah, exactly.
JD, do you think that Bob should address the fundamental paradox of his position in being the most successful airline executive of his time and probably of any other time, since or before deregulation, and yet he hated deregulation, hated the system?
It's not a paradox. It's not a paradox. These are two separate areas of activity and concern. My view as a U.S. citizen is that I'm concerned about public policy. I want to see the United States make the right choices. As a businessman, I have to you make the rules, I play by them.
The lawyers make the rules.
Whatever, I hope not. I hope others other than lawyers get at least a shot at making the rules. But the reality, whatever the rules are, the legislators make the rules. As a businessman, I got to play by these rules.
Right.
And we played very effectively. That does not mean that I think they were sound public policy. So there's no paradox there.
How did you do it?
How did
you tackle this issue of deregulation and become so successful? What do you think the formula was? And why can't the formula be repeated?
The formula was necessity is, desperation. In desperation, you go do what you need to do. American at the time of deregulation was very close to failure. I mean, it was a failing airline. All of a sudden, we got deregulation. We said we got the wrong airplanes flying the wrong routes, in the wrong configurations, with an IT system that's behind the times. We got to do something. What should we do? The answer turned out to be, let's go talk to the pilots and say to the pilots, look, as we sit here in 1981, it takes you guys 21 years to get from the right seat to the left seat. And most of you will never get there because the airline's getting smaller. So I'll make you a deal. If you agree to let me hire new pilots for 40% less than I pay you guys and get lots more productivity out of them, I'll go buy 250 new airplanes. They agreed. That's what we did. You know what the automobile companies are now doing is exactly what we did in 1981. We created market rate jobs. And we hired another 35,000 people and bought 250 airplanes, and that worked. So then we bought another 250 airplanes, hired another 35,000 people, and that worked too. So by that time, we had about 800 airplanes and about 100,000 people.
Why was American failing under regulation?
I wasn't there then.
You don't, nobody ever told you.
They were doing wrong. I mean, they did a lot of stuff wrong. They paid people too much. They chose the wrong routes. They chose the wrong airplanes, whatever. Whatever any airline does wrong. So we went off and did what I thought we needed to do. And once we started to grow, I said, wait a minute. Everybody's doing the same thing here. Why, this doesn't make any sense. Let's see if we can't find a better way to price seats according to value. So we invented Super Sabre fares, and we invented yield management, and so on and so on. And then we used IT to model the airline. So if I can get an extra 10% utilization out of my fleet, then I've just got 10% of my fleet is free. So we built very elaborate computer models of the fleet and how to best assign the fleet. And we did the same thing in terms of fleet manning models. We had 10,000 pilots and 22,000 flight attendants. And so we said, this is the most efficient way to assign those people. And we did all those things better than anybody else because we had a more capable IT staff and a big OR staff.
And then you did Sabre.
Well, Sabre was part of all of that.
Part of that.
And who invented the frequent flyer program inside your company?
No one guy. Nobody, one guy never invents anything. You know, when things get created, it's the process, it is the product of a creative process. There's a lot of smart people who sit around and they think of this and they think of that, and out of that comes some kind of a product definition. Mm-hmm. So there were a couple of dozen people that were very actively involved in the creation of the frequent flyer model. That was good.
It just shows once again the tremendous ability of a manager who knows what he's doing, who can motivate his people,
Yeah.
who can be called the leading manager of an American airline in the country. So, and
a combination of good luck and the right circumstances and the right people and an ambition to do that. And it all came out very well. But that's what we did. I mean, as all of a sudden the rules changed, we could do a lot of different things, and we thought of those new things to do sooner than our competitors did.
All right. And today, American is the strongest American legacy carrier?
No, I'm not sure that's right. But that's neither here nor there. The fact is, American is today what American is. like most of the rest of the legacy carriers, it has way too much debt, very heavy balance sheet, and a very difficult time of it. The guys who are running it, I think, are doing a decent job of doing it, but the circumstances are very difficult.
Well, again, I want to just say thank you. You've been, it's been a delight to have a chance to hear stories, to hear your thoughts, your analysis of where we've been, where we're going, and the challenges you've placed here, and to share with us.
It's been fun. Let's hope a bunch of law students see it. Maybe they won't make quite as many mistakes.
We got to get the lawyers on the right track. I'll turn this back over to Professor Havel.
Thank you, JD. I apologize for stepping in as a co-interlocutor for a few minutes. I did it because this was a fascinating conversation and I had to ask a few questions. And I don't necessarily agree with everything that Bob has to say. He knows that. And it cannot be said that the International Aviation Law Institute does not welcome or does not even showcase alternative views, and we did so today. We're not necessarily completely in harmony, but with the, you are not, Bob, completely in harmony with the philosophical preferences, perhaps, of this institute. But there's no doubt that if there is a coherent intellectual position with respect to re-regulation and the possibilities for re-regulation, and if that position is that, as you said, there are public policy criteria other than price, and if price was at the core of the deregulation initiative and experiment, as you seem to have as a theme in your discussion with us today, then you have made that case. And I think we're going to study what you said, and I think a lot of people looking at this will see it as great interest and value in looking back at the deregulation experiment, which, as we talked about at the very beginning, flowed from the minds of academic economists into the lap of people like yourself who had to deal with it in the real world and did so. And thank God your wife said that she wanted to do some exotic travel and brought you into the airline industry and gave deregulation a period when it actually was a huge success. So I want to thank you. I want to thank JD, of course. We will give you a copy of my book on open skies, and next time you come, it won't be a conversation, it'll be a full-fledged debate.
Good
and
show.
we can, and I'll check whether you've taken off the plastic wrapper to see whether you've actually taken a look at it. I want to thank our invited audience. We've had a small audience here in the Rare Book Room. We've had students and prospective students. We've had Matt Anderson from Booz Allen, and we had earlier Julie Ottinger from United Airlines, students in the current International Aviation Law and Policy class, and Jonathan Davis joined us, prospective LLM student. Bob, thank you for going on the record with us today. I hope that lots of people, as I said, will access this conversation on our website. I wish you continued health and success in everything that you're doing. We'll have a fourth iteration of our series in the spring at a city yet to be announced. Can't disclose anything yet. And for the moment, goodbye from Chicago, and thank you for watching.